The story begins with a death that never felt finished, a moment in American history that closed too quickly and left behind a silence heavy with doubt. A sitting president collapsed after a single summer celebration, his body failing within days, his final hours clouded by confusion rather than clarity. There was no long decline, no drawn-out farewell, no medical certainty to anchor the explanation. What remained instead was a question that refused to stay buried. On a blistering July day in 1850, Zachary Taylor stood for hours under an unforgiving sun at what would one day become the Washington Monument. The heat pressed down on the crowd, the ceremony dragged on, and the president, known for his physical toughness, brushed off the warning signs. When he returned to the White House, exhausted and dehydrated, he did what many would have done at the time. He drank cold milk and water, ate raw fruit, and tried to cool himself as quickly as possible. Within hours, his body rebelled. Severe stomach pain followed, then relentless vomiting and diarrhea, symptoms that escalated with frightening speed. The doctors called it cholera morbus, a vague diagnosis that covered almost any sudden digestive collapse, and they treated him with the full force of 19th century medicine. Blood was drawn from a man already drained of fluids. Blisters were raised to pull illness toward the skin. Mercury-based compounds were administered to purge his system. Opium dulled the pain while quietly suppressing the body's ability to recover. Each intervention was delivered with confidence, and each one pushed him further from stability. For days, observers noted brief moments where he seemed better, enough to spark hope, enough to delay the realization that his decline was irreversible. On July 9th, he died. There was no autopsy. His family wanted privacy, and at the time, no rule demanded further examination. The official explanation entered the record and moved on, but the absence of proof left a crack that never closed. The nation he left behind was already fractured. Debates over slavery were sharpening into open hostility, and Taylor's firm opposition to its expansion had placed him directly in the path of powerful interests. When he died so suddenly, whispers began almost immediately. Some newspapers hinted that the timing was too convenient, that a president who blocked compromise solutions had become an obstacle removed. No evidence was offered, only suspicion shaped by politics rather than science. Yet suspicion does not need facts to survive. It only needs uncertainty. Decades passed, and the story hardened into a quiet mystery. Biographers noted inconsistencies in the medical notes. One physician emphasized vomiting, another diarrhea. Some suggested brief improvement. Others insisted he never truly stabilized. The language was imprecise, built on observation rather than measurement. Without an autopsy, no explanation could be confirmed or conclusively dismissed. As time stretched on, the idea of poisoning lingered at the edges of historical discussion, not because it was proven, but because nothing had ever tested it. By the early 20th century, the rumor had become part of a larger fascination with unexplained presidential deaths, a question mark carried forward by repetition rather than discovery. What made the story endure was not drama, but absence. No physical evidence had ever been examined, no laboratory analysis applied, no modern method brought to bear on a 19th century death. The record rested entirely on assumptions made in a different era, under different standards, with tools that could not see what science can see now. More than a century later, that absence itself became impossible to ignore. Advances in forensic science had made it possible to detect toxins long after burial, to measure what once could only be guessed. Arsenic, the poison most often named in the rumors, does not vanish with time. It binds to bone, hair, and nails, leaving a chemical signature that can persist for generations. The question was no longer whether theories existed, but whether they deserved to stand without ever being tested. To some, reopening the case felt unnecessary, even disrespectful. To others, it felt inevitable. History had been telling the same incomplete story for 140 years. A president had died too quickly, under conditions too poorly documented, at a moment too politically charged to ever fully settle the matter. The silence around his death had grown louder than any accusation. And so the idea took shape that the only way to quiet it was not with another interpretation, but with evidence. Before the coffin was ever touched, before a single test was run, the true tension of the story had already formed. It was not about proving murder or defending innocence. It was about confronting a long-standing uncertainty and asking whether history should be allowed to rest on unanswered questions simply because time has passed. This was the moment where speculation would finally meet science, where a century of doubt would be placed against measurable truth, and where whatever waited inside that sealed coffin would either confirm the whispers or finally silence them. To understand why Zachary Taylor's death unsettled the nation so deeply, it is necessary to look beyond his final days and into the life that preceded them, a life shaped by discipline, endurance, and a reputation built far from the political intrigue that would later surround his name. Taylor did not rise through eloquence or ideology. He rose through survival. Born in 1784 on the American frontier, he grew up in an environment where hardship was not an exception but a constant. Comfort was rare, and authority came not from words but from action. That background followed him into the Army, where he spent decades in remote posts, enduring disease, heat, isolation, and the slow grind of military life that offered little glory and even less public attention. He was not polished. He was not theatrical. What he became instead was dependable, a man known for physical resilience and a refusal to dramatize pain or fatigue. Those traits later became central to his public image and quietly shaped how people interpreted his death. By the time Taylor entered national politics, he was already an anomaly. He had never held elected office. He had not spent years navigating party machinery or cultivating alliances. His fame came almost entirely from his role as a general, particularly his victories during the Mexican-American War. To many Americans, he represented stability rather than ambition, a figure who appeared immune to the games of Washington because he had been forged elsewhere. That perception mattered. When he assumed the presidency, he carried with him an expectation of toughness, of physical durability, of a man unlikely to be undone by stress or weakness. This was not a president people imagined collapsing suddenly from stomach illness. That contrast between reputation and outcome would later fuel disbelief. Taylor's personal habits reinforced that image. He was known to live simply, even while holding immense authority. He dressed plainly, ate without indulgence, and maintained a routine shaped more by military order than political ceremony. He did not cultivate the refined social presence that many of his contemporaries embraced. To supporters, this made him authentic. To critics, it made him unpredictable. He did not belong cleanly to either major political faction, and his independence unsettled those who relied on negotiation and compromise to maintain influence. Nowhere was this more evident than in the escalating conflict over slavery's expansion into new territories. Despite being a slaveholder himself, Taylor opposed the extension of slavery into lands acquired after the Mexican-American War. His position was not framed as a moral crusade, but as a practical one. He believed that prolonging the debate through compromise measures would only deepen sectional divisions. Instead, he pushed for immediate statehood for California and New Mexico without slavery provisions, a move that threatened the balance of power in Congress. Southern leaders viewed this stance as a betrayal. They expected alignment. What they encountered instead was resistance from a president who did not owe his power to their support. This resistance sharpened political tensions and placed Taylor in direct opposition to influential figures who had long shaped national policy. Behind the scenes, the pressure was intense. Letters, speeches, and private meetings reflected a climate thick with warnings and ultimatums. Some Southern politicians openly discussed secession if their interests were not protected. Taylor, drawing on his military background, reportedly dismissed these threats with blunt confidence, suggesting that rebellion would be met with force if necessary. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they contributed to an image of a president standing alone against powerful currents. It is within this charged atmosphere that his sudden illness would later be reevaluated, not simply as a medical event, but as a political interruption. At the same time, Washington itself was a hazardous environment. The city in 1850 lacked modern sanitation. Sewage systems were primitive, clean water was not guaranteed, and outbreaks of gastrointestinal illness were common, particularly in summer. For residents, sickness was an accepted risk of daily life. Yet presidents were often assumed to be insulated from such dangers, protected by status if not by science. Taylor was not. He moved freely among crowds, attended public events, and exposed himself to the same conditions as those around him. This proximity to risk was consistent with his character, but it also meant that his health was subject to the same unseen threats. Medical practice offered little protection. Physicians relied on tradition more than evidence, and treatment often intensified illness rather than alleviating it. Taylor trusted his doctors, as most people did, and there is no indication that he questioned their methods. His confidence in authority, shaped by years of command, may have made him more compliant, not less. In retrospect, this trust appears tragic, but at the time, it was unremarkable. What makes it significant is how it intersects with his reputation. A man known for endurance submitted quietly to treatments that drained his strength, and when he died, the contrast between who he was and how he fell became impossible to ignore. This background explains why the official explanation never fully settled. Taylor was not seen as fragile. He was not seen as politically expendable in the ordinary sense. His death felt abrupt, not only in timing, but in narrative. It cut across expectations built over a lifetime. When historians later returned to the sparse medical notes, they did so with this broader context in mind, aware that the story of his death could not be separated from the life that preceded it. The uncertainty that followed was not born solely from missing data, but from a deeper dissonance between the man America thought it knew and the way he disappeared from history. The moment the question was reopened, the story shifted from history into the present, transforming a long-settled death into a living controversy. For more than a century, Zachary Taylor's final illness had existed as a footnote, revisited occasionally, but never challenged with anything more than interpretation. Then, quietly at first, the idea emerged that interpretation was no longer enough. Advances in forensic science had changed the rules. What once depended on trust in 19th-century doctors could now be examined through measurable evidence. The proposal itself was unsettling. Exhuming a former president was not a symbolic gesture or a theatrical act. It was an intrusion into a space long treated as sacred, and it carried implications far beyond one man's remains. The question was no longer just how Taylor died, but whether history had the right to reopen its most private chapters when new tools made certainty possible. The push toward action came not from political movements or sensational journalists, but from a historian confronting the limitations of the record. When the medical notes from 1850 were reviewed closely, their weaknesses became impossible to ignore. They lacked timelines, contradicted one another, and relied on terminology that blurred diagnosis rather than clarifying it. Vomiting and diarrhea were recorded, but without context. Improvement was noted, but without measurements. Decline was described, but without explanation. In modern terms, the documentation would not have supported even a basic clinical assessment. The realization was simple and unsettling. The accepted cause of death rested entirely on assumption. No one had ever tested it. That realization alone carried weight. It meant that every confident statement made about Taylor's death was built on ground that had never been examined. Science offered a path forward, but also imposed strict demands. Arsenic, the poison most often cited in the rumors, was known to leave long-lasting traces in bone, hair, and nails. If Taylor had been poisoned, the evidence should still exist, even after 140 years. But this possibility came with conditions. Contamination had to be controlled. Procedures had to meet forensic standards. Results had to withstand public scrutiny. This was not an experiment that could be improvised or rushed. Before any coffin could be opened, permission had to be secured from those with legal and moral authority over the remains. That process alone took months. Finding the closest living descendant was not straightforward. Generations had passed, family lines had branched, and records were incomplete. When contact was finally made, the request carried enormous gravity. The decision was not framed as an accusation or an attempt to rewrite history. It was presented as an effort to resolve uncertainty that had lingered for more than a century. Leaving the question unanswered, it was argued, served neither scholarship nor legacy. The descendant understood what was at stake. Granting consent meant allowing a former president's resting place to be disturbed. Denying it meant allowing speculation to persist indefinitely. The approval that followed was not enthusiastic, but deliberate. It acknowledged that clarity, even if uncomfortable, was preferable to endless doubt. Legal authorization proved equally complex. Because the burial site lay in Kentucky, state authorities were involved. Because Taylor was a federal historical figure, national agencies had to be notified. Each layer of approval required justification, documentation, and assurances that the process would be controlled and respectful. The proposal was reviewed by forensic experts, legal officials, and preservation authorities. The question was asked repeatedly. Was this necessary? Could it cause harm? Would the results actually answer anything? Only when every objection had been addressed did permission finally come through. The exhumation was authorized in 1991, and with that decision, the story entered a new phase. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Headlines focused on the rarity of the act rather than its purpose. Opening a president's coffin became the dominant image, overshadowing the scientific reasoning behind it. Some commentators framed the move as sensational, suggesting it implied murder without evidence. Others defended it as a responsible use of modern tools to correct historical ambiguity. The debate revealed a deeper tension about how history should be handled. Was it something to be preserved as received, or something to be tested when new methods allowed greater accuracy? The discussion grew louder as the date approached, and the scientific work itself receded into the background of public opinion. Behind the scenes, preparation was meticulous. The mausoleum was assessed for structural stability. Engineers planned how to remove the metal-lined coffin without damaging it. Forensic specialists coordinated their roles, ensuring that each step would be documented and that contamination would be minimized. Tools were sterilized. Containers were prepared and labeled in advance. The chain of custody was planned before a single sample was touched. This was not an excavation driven by curiosity, but a controlled operation designed to produce results that could stand up to scrutiny decades later. When the day arrived, the atmosphere was quiet and tightly regulated. Access to the site was restricted. Each participant followed a defined protocol. The coffin, sealed for generations, was lifted and opened within the mausoleum itself. What lay inside was what time had left behind. Soft tissue was gone, but bone remained. Hair and nail fragments had survived, fragile but usable. There was no visible sign of poisoning, but there could not have been. Arsenic does not announce itself to the eye. It reveals itself only through analysis. The examiners documented everything before collecting samples. Bone fragments were removed carefully. Hair and nails were clipped and sealed. Each piece was logged, labeled, and secured. When the work was done, the coffin was resealed and returned to its place. The physical intrusion ended as quietly as it had begun. The samples were sent to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where the story shifted once again, this time from the cemetery to the laboratory. Neutron activation analysis was selected for its precision and reliability. It allowed scientists to measure trace elements with extraordinary accuracy. Early readings confirmed what was expected. Arsenic was present. In the 19th century, it was everywhere in medicines, in dyes, in water. Its presence alone meant nothing. The question was concentration and pattern. Lethal exposure produces spikes and uneven distribution across tissues. Environmental exposure produces low, uniform levels. The distinction was critical. As testing continued, the data began to form a clear picture. The levels detected fell within the range expected for a person living in Taylor's era. There were no spikes, no irregularities, no chemical signature consistent with poisoning. Analysts refined the measurements, compared tissue types, and adjusted for age-related changes. The results held. What surprised many was not the conclusion itself, but how decisively it emerged. After so many years of speculation, the science was unambiguous. Arsenic had not killed Zachary Taylor. Yet even this clarity did not immediately quiet the controversy. Some critics questioned whether the samples represented the final weeks of Taylor's life. Others argued that no test could ever fully reconstruct the past. But these objections existed at the margins. The central question that had driven the exhumation had been answered. The tragic event that had reignited the story did not confirm a conspiracy. It dismantled one. What remained was a sobering truth. A president had likely died from a severe gastrointestinal illness, worsened by contaminated food or water and compounded by the medical practices of his time. The drama was not in a hidden assassin, but in the limits of knowledge and the cost of acting without it. The findings closed one door, but they opened another, quieter and more unsettling. With arsenic eliminated as a cause of death, the focus shifted from conspiracy to consequence, from speculation to the weight of what actually happened. Zachary Taylor's death was no longer a mystery driven by hidden enemies, but a tragedy shaped by environment, medical practice, and timing. The implications of that shift reached far beyond the laboratory results. They forced a reevaluation not only of how he died, but of how his absence altered the course of the nation at a critical moment. Taylor's death removed a stabilizing figure from an already fragile political landscape. His presidency, though brief, had been defined by a refusal to yield to sectional pressure. He stood against compromise measures that he believed would only delay conflict, and his firmness disrupted political expectations on both sides. When he died, that resistance vanished overnight. Power did not simply pass to another leader. It changed direction. His successor inherited not just the office, but the unresolved crisis that Taylor had been confronting head-on. Without his presence, the path cleared for legislative solutions that Taylor had resisted, reshaping the balance of power in Washington. Within months, the Compromise of 1850 moved forward. Measures that Taylor had opposed were now negotiated and enacted, temporarily easing tensions but embedding new contradictions into the nation's legal framework. The shift was subtle but profound. Taylor's death did not cause these outcomes alone, but removed a critical obstacle at a decisive moment. In that sense, his passing functioned as a pivot. History did not pause to mourn before adjusting its course. It moved on, altered by the sudden absence of a man who had chosen confrontation over concession. On a personal level, the consequences were equally stark. Taylor's family was left with grief complicated by uncertainty. There was no definitive explanation to provide closure, only a general diagnosis that could not be proven. For generations, that uncertainty lingered as a private burden. The rumors that circulated publicly were not abstract theories. They intersected with personal loss, raising questions that family members could neither confirm nor silence. The exhumation, more than a century later, did not reopen emotional wounds so much as acknowledge that they had never fully healed. The medical findings also forced a reassessment of 19th century healthcare. Taylor's death became a case study in the unintended harm caused by accepted practices. Bloodletting, purgatives, and blistering were administered with the intention of saving him, yet they likely accelerated his decline. This realization carries a quiet gravity. It reframes his death not as an unavoidable fate, but as a consequence of knowledge that had not yet evolved. The doctors acted within the norms of their time, confident in methods that modern science now recognizes as dangerous. Taylor trusted them, and that trust proved fatal. The tragedy lies not in negligence, but in the limits of understanding. Public reaction to the forensic conclusion reflected this complexity. Many expressed relief that the long-standing accusation of poisoning had been laid to rest. Others felt a different kind of discomfort. The absence of a villain left little room for dramatic resolution. There was no enemy to condemn, no plot to unravel. Instead, the story ended with a quieter truth. A powerful man succumbed to ordinary risks, magnified by circumstance and flawed care. For some, that conclusion felt anticlimactic. For others, it felt deeply human. The controversy surrounding the exhumation itself also left a lasting mark. Clara Rising, whose work initiated the investigation, faced criticism both before and after the results were released. Some accused her of sensationalism, arguing that reopening the case implied suspicion without cause. Others praised her for insisting that history be grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Once the findings were made public, the debate shifted again. Rising included the results openly, acknowledging that the poisoning theory she had examined was not supported. Yet the public reaction demonstrated how difficult it can be to disentangle intent from outcome. The act of questioning history was, for some, indistinguishable from accusing it. The broader academic community absorbed the findings with a mixture of acceptance and reflection. Most historians agreed that the forensic analysis provided the strongest available answer and that no competing evidence justified reopening the case again. A small number raised methodological concerns, not to dispute the conclusion, but to emphasize the limits inherent in working with remains so old. These critiques underscored an important point. Even definitive science operates within constraints. The absence of proof for poisoning does not recreate the precise biological process that ended Taylor's life. It narrows the possibilities, but it does not deliver absolute certainty about every detail. What endures is the recognition that Taylor's death was shaped by forces larger than any single decision. Environmental exposure, inadequate sanitation, medical tradition, and political context all converged within a narrow window of time. The forensic findings did not dramatize these forces. They exposed them. In doing so, they shifted the narrative away from intrigue and toward consequence. The real impact of Taylor's death lies not in what was hidden, but in what was revealed. It revealed how fragile even the most powerful figures can be when knowledge fails them. It revealed how quickly political trajectories can change when a single voice disappears. And it revealed that the most unsettling truths are often the simplest ones, stripped of mystery but heavy with implication. As the public debate faded and the scientific conclusion settled into the historical record, a quieter layer of the story remained, one that never dominated headlines but continued to echo beneath them. These were the moments that never made it into official reports, the small human details that shaped the experience of those closest to the events and revealed how uncertainty can persist even after answers appear. Long before the exhumation, there were private conversations within Taylor's family, fragments of doubt passed down through generations. They did not frame his death as a mystery to be solved, but as a loss that never quite found its footing. Without a definitive explanation, grief existed alongside unanswered questions, and that ambiguity quietly reshaped memory. In letters written years after Taylor's death, relatives avoided speculation but hinted at discomfort with the official account. They described the shock of his rapid decline, the confusion surrounding his treatment, and the sense that events had moved too fast for understanding to catch up. These were not accusations, only expressions of disorientation. The president who had survived decades of military hardship had been undone in days. For those who knew him intimately, this contrast was difficult to reconcile. It created a silence where certainty should have been, and that silence lingered far longer than any rumor printed in newspapers. Among historians who revisited the case in the 20th century, a similar unease appeared, though it took a different form. Many accepted that environmental illness and medical misjudgment were the most plausible explanations. Yet when they examined the surviving notes, they often paused at what was missing rather than what was present. There were no precise observations of fluid loss, no consistent record of vital signs, no detailed chronology of how symptoms evolved hour by hour. The absence of these details did not prove wrongdoing, but prevented closure. Some scholars admitted privately that while they did not believe Taylor was poisoned, they were uncomfortable stating with confidence what exactly killed him. That discomfort rarely surfaced in published work, but it influenced how the story was taught and discussed. The exhumation brought those buried uncertainties into the open, but it also revealed new ones. Even as the arsenic theory was dismantled, questions about the final days remained. What role did dehydration truly play? How much damage was caused by bloodletting and mercury-based purgatives? Would a different approach, even by the standards of the time, have changed the outcome? These questions were not answerable through forensic testing alone. They belong to the realm of medical history, where context matters as much as chemistry. The science could rule out poisoning, but it could not recreate the cascade of physiological stress that unfolded in Taylor's body during his last hours. There were also the unspoken pressures surrounding the doctors who treated him. In 1850, caring for a president was both an honor and a burden. Every decision carried political and professional consequences. Deviating from accepted practice could invite criticism if the patient died. Following convention offered protection, even if convention was flawed. In that sense, the physicians were constrained by the same structures that constrained everyone else. Their actions were shaped by expectation and fear as much as by medical reasoning. This context does not absolve the harm caused, but it explains how it occurred without malice. Taylor's death became a quiet example of how authority can reinforce error, not because individuals intend harm, but because systems resist deviation. Years after the forensic findings were released, discussions continued in academic circles about whether the investigation had truly exhausted all possibilities. Some raised the issue of sampling, suggesting that hair strands closest to the scalp might have revealed different results if they had survived. Others noted that the condition of the remains limited what could be tested. These critiques did not overturn the conclusion, but they served as reminders that even well-designed studies operate within limits. Time erases evidence selectively, preserving some traces while destroying others. What survives shapes what can be known. For Clara Rising, the aftermath carried its own weight. Despite her transparency in publishing results that contradicted the poisoning theory, she became a symbol in a debate she had not intended to ignite. Some continued to associate her work with accusation rather than resolution. In interviews, she emphasized that her goal had never been to prove a crime, but to replace assumption with evidence. Yet public narratives are not easily redirected. Once a story enters popular imagination, it often resists correction. Rising's experience highlighted a broader truth about historical inquiry. Asking a question can be interpreted as taking a side, even when the answer leads away from drama and toward restraint. What remains most striking is how the quiet details of Taylor's death mirror the quiet forces that shape history itself. Decisions made under imperfect knowledge. Confidence placed in systems later revealed to be flawed. Outcomes determined not by intention, but by convergence. The absence of a villain does not diminish the tragedy. It deepens it. A president did not fall to intrigue or betrayal, but to the ordinary dangers of his time, magnified by trust in methods that promise control and deliver collapse. In the end, the story's most intimate layer is not found in the laboratory data or political aftermath, but in the shared human experience of uncertainty. Families, doctors, historians, and citizens all confronted the same limitation. They wanted certainty where none existed. The exhumation provided clarity on one question, but it also exposed how many others can never be fully answered. This is the quiet truth that lingers beneath the resolved mystery. History can be clarified, but it cannot be completed. There will always be moments that resist reconstruction, spaces where evidence ends and interpretation begins. Zachary Taylor's death lives in that space, no longer haunted by conspiracy, yet still marked by the silence of what cannot be recovered. With the passage of time, Zachary Taylor's story has shifted away from the question of how he died and toward what his life and death reveal about power, knowledge, and legacy. Once the forensic debate faded, what remained was not a mystery to be solved, but a reflection on the fragile intersection between authority and limitation. Taylor had been a man shaped by endurance, someone who believed in discipline, order, and decisive action. Yet the end of his life exposed a truth that no rank or reputation could escape. Even the most powerful figures are bound by the understanding of their era, and when that understanding fails, strength alone offers no protection. Taylor's legacy is often measured in what he did not live long enough to complete. His presidency lasted just 16 months, an interval too brief to define a comprehensive agenda, yet long enough to leave a distinct imprint. He entered office without deep allegiance to party machinery, relying instead on personal authority and military credibility. That independence gave him the confidence to confront sectional pressures directly. He resisted compromise not because he underestimated its appeal, but because he believed delay would worsen the inevitable conflict. Whether history would have validated that judgment remains unknowable, but his sudden absence ensured that the question would never be tested. The policies that followed his death reflected a different philosophy, one that favored negotiation over confrontation. The Compromise of 1850 offered temporary stability at the cost of embedding contradictions that would later erupt into civil war. Taylor's stance, in retrospect, appears stark and uncompromising, yet also appears unusually clear. He saw division hardening and refused to soften it with half measures. His death removed that clarity from the political landscape, replacing it with solutions designed to buy time rather than resolve tension. In that sense, his legacy is defined as much by interruption as by action. There is also a quieter lesson embedded in the medical aspect of his story. Taylor trusted the best available expertise of his time, and that trust failed him. This is not an indictment of individual doctors, but a reminder of how progress is often written in loss. Medical knowledge advances because past certainty is proven wrong. Taylor's death illustrates the cost of that process. Treatments administered with confidence inflicted harm because their underlying assumptions were flawed. Today, those practices appear reckless. In their own time, they were standard. This gap between intention and outcome underscores the humility that modern science must maintain. What is accepted now may one day be judged with the same disbelief. The forensic investigation that reopened Taylor's case represents another dimension of his legacy. It demonstrated how modern tools can illuminate the past without sensationalism, replacing conjecture with evidence. The decision to exhume a former president was not driven by spectacle, but by a commitment to accuracy. When the results contradicted popular rumor, they were released without hesitation. This willingness to follow data rather than narrative stands as a model for historical inquiry. It shows that respect for legacy does not require preserving myth. It requires confronting uncertainty honestly, even when the answer is less dramatic than expected. Yet the investigation also revealed the limits of such efforts. Science can rule out possibilities, but it cannot reconstruct every detail lost to time. Taylor's precise cause of death remains broadly defined rather than pinpointed. He likely succumbed to a severe gastrointestinal illness exacerbated by dehydration and medical intervention, but the exact sequence of physiological failure will never be known. This incompleteness is not a failure of method. It is a condition of history itself. Evidence decays. Context fades. At some point, explanation gives way to probability. Taylor's legacy therefore exists in layers. At the surface is the resolution of a long-standing rumor, the confirmation that he was not assassinated. Beneath that lies a reflection on how political power can hinge on the health of a single individual. His death altered the trajectory of national policy at a critical moment, not through intention, but through absence. Beneath that lies a more universal truth. Systems built on confidence, whether political or medical, can collapse when their assumptions are wrong. And beneath that, there is the quiet human lesson. Lives shaped by strength and discipline can still end in vulnerability, not because of weakness, but because no one operates outside the limits of their time. In remembering Zachary Taylor, the temptation is to focus on what might have been, on alternate paths history could have taken had he lived longer. Yet his story gains depth when it is understood not as an unfinished triumph or a thwarted ambition, but as a case study in constraint. His authority did not save him. His certainty did not protect him. What endures instead is the reminder that progress often emerges from confronting the boundaries of knowledge rather than denying them. Taylor's life and death, examined through both history and science, leave behind a legacy defined not by conspiracy or drama, but by the sober recognition that even the most decisive figures are shaped, and sometimes undone, by the world they inherit. In the end, Zachary Taylor's story does not conclude with revelation or scandal, but with a lingering stillness that invites reflection rather than judgment. The long arc of his death, from sudden collapse to century-old rumor to forensic examination, reveals how easily uncertainty can harden into belief when evidence is absent. For generations, the lack of an autopsy allowed imagination to fill the void. Political tension gave that imagination direction, and repetition gave it endurance. When science finally intervened, it did not uncover a hidden crime. It uncovered the limits of what had been known and the consequences of acting within those limits. Taylor's coffin was opened not to disturb his rest, but to settle a question that history could not answer on its own. The answer that emerged was definitive in one sense and incomplete in another. He was not poisoned. The theory that had persisted for more than a century collapsed under measurable data. Yet the precise mechanics of his death remain only broadly defined. A severe gastrointestinal illness, likely worsened by contaminated food or water and compounded by aggressive medical treatment, remains the most plausible explanation. This conclusion lacks the drama of conspiracy, but it carries a quieter weight. It forces us to confront a reality where tragedy arises not from malice, but from circumstance, trust, and limited understanding. The resolution of the case reshaped Taylor's place in historical memory. He is no longer framed as a potential victim of political assassination, but as a man overtaken by the ordinary dangers of his time. This reframing strips away suspicion while revealing vulnerability. It reminds us that leadership does not confer immunity. Power cannot insulate the body from disease, nor can authority override the constraints of knowledge. Taylor's death, viewed through this lens, becomes a mirror reflecting the fragility that underlies even the strongest institutions. There's also a lesson in how the story was handled once answers became available. The willingness to publish results that contradicted popular belief demonstrated an integrity often tested, but not always upheld. It showed that historical inquiry reaches its highest value when it accepts outcomes that do not flatter expectation. In choosing evidence over narrative, the investigation honored both scholarship and legacy. It allowed Taylor's story to rest on what could be proven rather than what could be imagined. Yet even with this resolution, the case leaves behind a subtle unease. It highlights how much of history depends on documentation that may be incomplete or biased by the norms of its era. Taylor's doctors acted according to accepted practice, yet their confidence proved harmful. His political environment magnified suspicion, yet suspicion alone could not reveal truth. His family lived with ambiguity for generations, not because answers were hidden, but because they were never sought with the tools required. These layers remind us that certainty in history is often provisional, shaped by what survives long enough to be examined. The story ultimately circles back to a broader question about how societies remember their leaders. Do we seek comfort in simple explanations, or are we willing to accept complexity when clarity is unavailable? Taylor's case suggests that unresolved questions invite myth, and myth can persist long after facts are accessible. It took more than a century and an extraordinary decision to replace speculation with evidence. That replacement did not simplify the story. It deepened it. It transformed a suspected crime into a reflection on time, knowledge, and consequence. As the final chapter closes, what remains is not an answer to every question, but an invitation to think differently about the past. Taylor's death teaches that history is not static. It can be revisited, not to rewrite it, but to understand it more honestly. It also teaches that some truths arrive without spectacle, demanding patience rather than outrage. In an age drawn to dramatic explanations, his story stands as a reminder that reality is often quieter, and its lessons more enduring because of that. Now, the question belongs not to scientists or historians, but to those who inherit the story. When evidence finally replaces rumor, does it bring closure, or does it simply shift the way we ask questions? Zachary Taylor's life ended abruptly, but the conversation his death inspired continues, not because of conspiracy, but because it touches something universal. The human desire to know, the discomfort of uncertainty, and the challenge of accepting that even definitive answers can leave something unresolved. In that space between what is proven and what is lost to time, history continues to speak, not with certainty, but with a quiet insistence that truth, however incomplete, is still worth pursuing.